Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar, Is Play the Ultimate Learning Tool for Children? My name's Kerry and Alicia and I will be hosting the webinar today. KidsMatter is funded by the Department of Health and Beyond Blue, and Early Childhood Australia is partnering with Beyond Blue and in school context with Headspace to support whole services and schools in implementing the KidsMatter framework and undertaking the professional learning that goes along with it. Is your service or school registered and participating in KidsMatter? If you are, great news. Our webinars will support your progress through the professional learning. And we've been presenting a whole series of these webinars in the past few months with still more to come. So if your school or service isn't registered, we suggest you register, and we've put the link in the chat for you to sign up. Feel free to ask any questions about participation and what's involved in growing healthy minds and well-being. Now let's get back to today, where we'll be discussing if play is the ultimate learning tool for children. Okay. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. In the chat, what lands are you joining us from today? So feel free to put your and share which lands you're participating in the webinar today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from all the lands from which we're all able to gather on today. I'm sitting on Turrbal land and Yugara, and I'd like to acknowledge but also pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and all those who continue to hold the memories, traditions and ways of being for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We recognise the importance of the continued connection to culture, country and community, to the health, social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And throughout today's webinar, I'd invite you to consider ways that play at your space is informed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives during play, and how this has contributed to relationships within your community and strengthening reconciliation practices. So consultants have had an opportunity to look at some yarns and to include some ideas about what our adults could actually do while children play. And some of the tips that have come out of those yarns have been around encouraging children to take healthy risks, supporting them when they feel the whole range of emotions, sometimes knowing when to stand back and trust children, and providing space for them to recreate experiences from home life. So in the chat, you can find a link to the KidsMatter action charts. And on the slide, there's a quote from a SNAPE document, a great document called Growing Up Our Way. And this resource highlights some things that we're going to be talking about today, and also some things that we'd like to consider for today's webinar. And that's around what ways does play happen at your place? How is this informed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children? And how has drawing on some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives during play contributed to relationships in your community? And communicated respect and commitment to reconciliation, and ultimately working towards realising a stronger future for Australian children. So today we're all here to consider, learn and reflect about early childhood wellbeing and education. And on our screen are the ways for today. So remember to look after yourself. That's a really important message. A sense of safety is the most foundational requirement for positive mental health, and that sense of security and for forming relationships. So be aware of how to look after yourself today and support each other. That can make a huge difference to each of us, to the wellbeing of our teams and to the children in our care. And we know that children build a picture of who they are by observing adults and modelling what they do. So we'll be asking you to interact and contribute during the webinar today. There'll be the opportunity for you to reflect on some of your own practices, and we'll do that through polls and reflective questions. But do feel that you can contribute only in the way that you feel comfortable. So we'll ask you to post things in the chat box, and we'll also put some links and resources in there for you to copy if you're interested. Sometimes unexpected feelings can emerge from some of the discussions that we have, even difficult ones. So be aware of those feelings, and if any of those come up for you, just make sure that you yarn with or talk to someone if you need to. Okay, so we can see on screen what we're going to be exploring today. We've got some great topic areas to be talking about. So Alicia and I are going to look at what and why play. We're going to be talking about things like play and how that relates to the curriculum frameworks. We're going to be looking at the risk and benefits attached to play, and also the role that educators have in play. And in our roles, we can use play to engage with children and support their learning development, mental health and well-being. So let's explore this more now. And we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts in the chat. So please share those with us as well. Okay, so we might actually stop and think a little about where we played as children, what we remember of our play, where we played and what we did, because this is really significant as to how we see children play today. And Alicia, I'd like to ask you, when you were a child, where did you play and what kind of play did you engage in?
I was quite lucky in that I grew up in a new suburb area here in the ACT, and I think we were one of 5 houses on the street and there were no fences put up yet. So I was able to directly walk from my back door right up to the mountains behind me. And I can remember playing in a waterfall area when I needed some alone time, and there being some wildflowers filled with, some fields filled with wildflowers for my friends and I. It was time to come home when the street lights came on. What about you, Kerry?
Yes, I spent a lot of time outdoors from morning to night, and mostly with other children in our neighbourhood. We did a lot of playing around tree houses. We had big mango trees, and I can remember having some great mango fights down the park. We also used to double up and play cricket and the boys versus the girls. Some games around dolls and pets, but most of it was really occurring outside. And quite a lot of play down by the river, you know, doing things like building canoes and fishing. So great fun.
And I can see there that there's some comments in the chat about also playing in the bush and the open spaces with other children. That's great. Thank you for sharing.
Yes. And looking what's come up in some of that chat shows us that it's very different today. Children aren't really playing very much in outdoor spaces, and where we roamed as children and what we did then is vastly different to how we and parents let children play today. So I'm wondering, why has play changed and what's actually changed for children? We know that there's been a shift in play preferences for young children in Australia recently, with children moving from playing outdoors to mostly playing indoors. And I guess a lot of the research, the independent research around this, would validate that. And some of that carried out over the past few years for Planet Ark actually demonstrates how many of these outdoor activities have actually moved towards extinction. So some of that research is saying, you know, 1 in 3 Aussie kids today play outside every day compared to around 3 in 4 children a generation ago. And only 1 in 3 Aussie kids have ever been camping or bushwalking. You know, 1 in every 4 Aussie kids have actually never climbed a tree. So once popular outdoor activities such as tag and chase games, you know, those games that I used to play, like hopscotch and jump rope, or exploring natural areas like gullies and reserves, and I think even bike riding, are all disappearing too. So why have these changes occurred? We might be asking what's been happening, and I guess some of the factors that have actually contributed to these changes include concerns around safety. There has been changes to family structure. We're going from, you know, 2 parents to 1 parent families, combined with kind of a move away from extended families, more 2 parents in a family working, and I guess increased use of out-of-home early childhood services and experiences. So perhaps more children engaging in things like enrichment programs after school and out of hours, and also a big one around more time in television and spent, you know, with computer games. And perhaps, you know, parent fears around safety also contribute to that, you know, helicopter parent kind of coined phrase that we hear a lot today. And all of those things are likely to lead to reduced opportunities to play and also reduced opportunities to take risk and make mistakes. And I'm going to read you a really interesting quote by Ken Finch about taking risks, just to reflect on this. Life itself is dangerous. Life is full of risks, and we should hope it remains so. Without taking risks, no child but to manage them and keep them in perspective. So that's really something to think about, I think. Let's look now at why children should play. We know play, a really important aspect of this, is around building brain development, and this is how children learn, and it really enables children to learn through engaging with the real world. And it also enables them to replay how they think the world works. So when children engage, you know, with play, being parents, educators, workmen, superheroes perhaps, and lots more to experience what it feels like, you can make sense of that. Children trying to make sense of that and build knowledge from that experience in those roles. And play also builds resilience and confidence. A little bit like, you know, a really tricky task like balancing on a board. Children can become confident when they succeed in practice and go and do it again. So they're really important areas. And it allows children to use their creativity while developing their imagination and their physical, cognitive and emotional strength. So a really big one when we're kind of talking about mental health, I think. Okay, so I think we're just about ready for a poll to be put up. Let's do a poll about play at your service. So this is, the poll question is, play embedded within your practice, principles and pedagogy.
Thanks everybody for starting to choose an option. I can see that we've got some results already. And it looks like, Kerry, already that play is pretty much in most to everything that educators are doing within their overall pedagogy.
Yes, yes. There's, you know, given play is embedded so significantly in the early years learning framework, many consider that play is actually in everything we do. I'm just wondering, you know, there's a great TED Talk quote around kind of reconsidering our definition of play by Peter Gray, and that, you know, play by definition is self-controlled and self-directed, and it's actually the self-directed nature of play that gives it its power.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we consider our definition of play and how it can actually feature in all aspects of our pedagogy, and that idea of how we incorporate play into routines and rituals as well. So thank you everybody for participating in that poll. That was fantastic. I think we could see there that everyone is striving to embed play into their curriculum, but I think it's about how we find the meaningful ways that we incorporate play and learn through play. It's actually about the do. It's important about how we consider the doing of play. What is our intention and how are we planning and providing for children through play? So before we consider the curriculum links, I think it's really important that we take a minute to stop and think of the underlying premise of the United Nations Conventions on the Right of the Child. Most of you would be familiar with this document, which is the Human Rights Treaty, developed 25 years ago and then ratified by Australia in 1990. And throughout the 42 articles, the document does describe the basic human rights that should be made available to all children. You can see here on the slide that we have a bit of a poem about Article 31 from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states that parties must recognise the right of the child to rest, leisure, and to engage in play and recreational activities appropriate to the age of the child and to participate freely in cultural life and the arts. So we invite you to reflect upon these words, particularly in relation to the diminishing scope that exists today, thinking about our own childhoods and what we were talking about. And I could see from the chat that a few more of you were talking about the outdoor nature of play that you engaged in and the way that you communicated with children in your local area. Thank you for all of that. So let's take a look at the specific links to play in our curriculum documents. The Early Years Learning Framework has a specific emphasis on play-based learning and the principles and practices that determine our pedagogy. It defines play-based learning as a context for learning through which children organise and make sense of their social worlds as they engage actively with people, objects and representations. The EYLF does mention learning through play as one of the early learning practices by providing a balance between child-led, child-initiated and educator-supported learning along with intentional teaching practices. Play is described as a context for learning that allows us to express our personality, enhances our dispositions of curiosity and creativity, enables children to make connections between prior learning and their new learning, assists children to develop relationships and concepts that stimulate well-being. Some states and territories do have their own frameworks, and we'd love for you to share in chat how the play is embedded in those documents that you use. Once children do move to school, it is often thought that play is not necessarily supported within the school curriculum. However, it's really important to note that play is mentioned many times in the Australian curriculum, and it's commonly referred to in science, art, health and physical education. So for example, English recommends play-based learning experience and history encourages the representation of historical ideas through play. I actually have a young friend of mine at the moment who's engaging in a school play all around the opening of Parliament House, which has been really interesting to hear about. Interestingly, little is mentioned about mathematics and play, and we do know that in early childhood, children do play when they learn about mathematical concepts. There is also a really useful document which shows how the EYLF is embedded into the Australian curriculum, and if you're interested, we're popping the link in the chat now. So I wonder why children should be playing. How does it benefit their overall development? I think we should take a look at that now. So we know that it is the right of the child to play, but what does it mean with respect to their development? Why should children be playing? Let's take a look at some nationwide data. This is the Australian Early Development Census, or the AEDC, and this is a nationwide teacher-completed early development instrument, kind of like a checklist that's used to gather information on children in their first year of formal full-time school. So there are over 100 questions that teachers complete with regards to the child, and it's completed in the first semester of that first year of school. The data does provide insight into children's physical health and well-being, their social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive skills, communication skills, and then overall general knowledge. So we can see in the table there that there's outlined national and then state and territory totals, as well as the percentages of children who are determined as developmentally vulnerable across each of the developmental domains from the year 2015. So if we take a look at the percentages across the developmental domains, we can see that the majority of children are developing well. However, we need to keep in mind the percentage of children who would benefit from additional support. The children represented in this table are vulnerable in one or more developmental domains and will require intervention when they enter primary school. It is our role as educators to ensure that children have the best possible start in life, and we can do this by increasing our understanding of children's development and how social and emotional skills are important in improving children's mental health and well-being. On the current AEDC figures, nearly 10% of children starting school have poor social skills and low self-confidence, and nearly 9% are anxious, unhappy, aggressive or hyperactive. And this means that there's a total of 28,000 children starting school each year unable to cope socially or emotionally. If you would like to improve your knowledge of social and emotional development, check out the link that we're popping in the chat box now. We do need to foster children's overall development through play, as this is age appropriate and essential for their mental health and wellbeing. The guiding principle for early childhood educators is that play is essential to optimise children's wellbeing, development and learning. And I can see here that a few of you have mentioned why you think play is important. You're telling me here that children should be playing for self-directed learning and interaction and to understand their place in the world. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. It's really lovely to hear. So we end up wrapping children's learning in that four-letter word, play, that few of us tend to understand and many outside our profession think is a bit purposeless and a bit of a waste of our time. The EYLF and the UN Convention Rights of the Child do provide a clear mandate for us, though, that says that play is how children learn. So we're going to have another poll for you shortly. It's all about unpacking what we do learn through children's play. What do we understand about children when they're engaging about play? So take a moment, just stop and have a think about a situation that you've observed recently, a situation where you saw a child playing and engaging in play. Think about whether it's an older child or a younger child engaging in that play situation, and consider what you actually took away from watching and observing that experience. What did you understand about that particular child from watching the play unfold? So there are lots of different choices there. I can see that some of you have already jumped in. Thank you. Please note that you can actually select more than one option, and if we haven't covered your idea in one of our categories, definitely let us know in the chat box. What can you see there, Kerry? What's taking your fancy?
Yeah, it's interesting. Alicia, I'm really watching number 7, the resilience, confidence and perseverance area, to see whether that's actually going up. But I think, you know, most people are interested in skills and strengths in all learning areas. That seems to be quite a popular area on the poll. And one of our participants is saying, look, I can, you know, seen examples of all of these. And I'm just thinking, you know, in terms of that resilience and confidence, that, you know, one thing for me that comes up is that observing how children regulate their emotions during play, and the intensity of those emotions can actually really give us some great clues about children's strengths and vulnerabilities and how we might support them to develop new social and emotional skills. So I find that's a really important one for me. But I guess you're just not, you know, going to see just one thing happening in play with children's learning. You're actually going to see lots of different things occurring when we as educators start to unpack that learning from play and start documenting it.
Absolutely. And you know, something that, oh, sorry, Kerry. Something that I think pops out for me is that idea that we do learn about their knowledge, skills, interests and strengths, but more so than that, it helps us to understand the style of learning that they engage in, the methods that they persist in order to encourage that level of resilience, and how they go about problem solving, which is really interesting to capture. And we can see here that there's a few more comments in the chat box. And one person, D, thank you, is saying that play allows us to observe the child holistically from all developmental domains. Absolutely.
And Sharon's commented that we need to look at all of the other areas that that's been suggested here today. Yes. So thanks, Sharon. I think there's, you know, there's a lot of different things going on. Okay, so we might move now to talking about whether play, how it relates to being a vehicle for children's learning and development. And we all know that play is important for children's physical development, but it's actually just as important for their mental development and their well-being. It provides children with opportunities to practice and to make sense of what they've seen around them and learn new ways of thinking and doing things. And in terms of brain development, we know that play stimulates various parts of the brain and actually strengthens brain development. We know that the brain develops rapidly in those first 5 years of life, and there are many positive windows of opportunity for educators to strengthen that development for young children. So I think educators are learning more and more about brain development, and this link with play I think is really important. So if we took a moment to think about a child who is actually playing in the sandpit and think about all the skills needed for them to participate in that play, we'd have a whole range of things. Play activating memory, language, sensory motor skills, self-regulation, planning and organisation, and learning and attention. So quite a lot of different skills there. And in the chat, you'll find a link to some more information on early childhood neurodevelopment. So I encourage you to have a look at that. But let's take a moment and focus on executive functioning, because this is a really important area when it comes to children's learning and play. Executive functioning refers to a range of higher order cognitive skills associated with self-regulation and goal-directed behaviour. And that can include things like planning, organisation, information updating, concept formation, reasoning, impulse control. These skills begin to develop in early childhood, and they do continue developing until early adulthood. And it's essential for children's learning and development to successfully lay the foundations of these skills in the early years. These early executive functioning skills are used when children are learning to read, write, and problem solve, but also things like, social areas, forming friendships, but engaging in play. These skills allow information to be held and mentally manipulated while filtering out any distractions. And research would tell us that having well-developed executive functioning skills has the greatest impact on academic success. So I think that's useful to reflect on. Engaging in play with others is one way children practice their executive skills. Play gives them the opportunity to use the skills they've been developing with the support of the adults around them. And through play, children learn how to lead, how to follow, setting up rules of play, how to win and lose, and also, dealing with emotions, things like anger, aggression, satisfaction, rejection, understanding who they are and having fun with other people. So if you took an example there, if we took an example, let's say, of a child playing shops, what skills do you think children actually might be using when they're engaging in that play? They have to decide what to use, who to play with, what to do, and how they'll use the equipment. And that does involve things like planning, organising, cooperating, problem solving, even self-regulating when it comes to emotions. However, there are risks when children play as well. Children can feel hurt, they can feel disappointed or frustrated, and adults do need to be close to observe and intervene when necessary for the well-being of children. And this is when we as educators, I guess, need to be really aware of our role. We need to pay particular attention when children's behaviour changes. So things like, are those children a little bit quieter than usual? Are they acting aggressively or maybe beginning to dominate in their play? Are they unable to concentrate, or perhaps are they reluctant to join in? They might all be questions that might cue us to take a closer look at what's happening in children's play. And they can also be signs that the child is not coping. They may need further support to work through those feelings and emotions, and getting further support from an adult around practicing their executive skills. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the things that we actually do in terms of those and unpacking some of those skills a little bit more, those executive skills. and looking at some of the educator roles. So our role as educators in play is really important. You can put that in the chat if you'd like to share some of your thoughts around your role as an educator in play and what you think that might be or what that might look like. The early years learning framework states that early childhood educators take on many roles in play with children, and these roles can be complex. We as educators understand why play is so fundamentally important, but I guess the question is, do we understand our role within it? So let's take a little closer look and just perhaps explore and unpack those educator roles, because I think there's many facets of this role, and I think we do these very well. One key role is educator professional judgment. The Early Years Learning Framework considers an educator's professional judgment as central to their role as a facilitator of children's learning. And when we use and make, I guess, professional judgments, we're doing a range of things. We're using our knowledge and skills. We're looking at our knowledge of children, families and communities. We're looking at our awareness of how around our own beliefs and values and perhaps how they impact on children's learning. And we might be bringing into play our personal styles and past experiences. We're also drawing on creativity, intuition and imagination, and helping children improvise and adjust their practice to suit the context of their learning. Jessica's just said, sometimes I think educators' role in play is to put ourselves in the children's shoes and be a friend with them. Yes. And that, you know, when we think about that, you know, that brings to mind, I guess, the role of empathy in children's play and, you know, all those great social and emotional skills around interacting with friends and, you know, those social interactions. So thanks, Jessica. There's some other comments around, you know, children's learning and development and facilitating extended learning. So yes, an educator has a really important role, I think, in facilitating that extended learning. Watching, listening and engaging, a really important one that educators do, and that's getting an idea of what children are interested in, what they're and what learning is actually taking place. So I guess as educators, we do engage with children by having conversations with them and by watching and listening to the progress of their play, and we would call that tuning in. When you engage with children, you gain an understanding of what's interesting to them, what's meaningful to them, what theories perhaps they might be testing out, and where we as educators can actually use spontaneous teachable moments to scaffold the children's learning. And another key role is actually understanding how children learn. So the emphasis here might be perhaps on observation, listening with children, and really understanding how they learn. So I guess relating back to some of the comments in the chat, you know, by understanding how the child is learning, you can actually provide a great balance between child-led, child-initiated and educator-supported learning, along with intentional teaching practices. We might consider that perhaps some play could be less valuable than other play for learning. Educators do need to be very aware of when to step in to intentionally support children to learn from what they're doing in their play. Sharon suggested that we can also be a player to intentionally teach. Yes, and that might relate to a point that we're going to talk about soon, Sharon, I think, in terms of, you know, having fun and engaging. Facilitating social interactions as well as assisting children to join in with play. Yes, thanks, Angela. Great comment. So planning is a role that educators do. We have a responsibility to plan for play. So it's not just a haphazard occurrence when we, you know, where we might put materials and equipment out and then we stand back and watch what happens or might not happen. We're actually very intentionally planning and implementing learning through play. And we provide experiences and environments that link to intended learning outcomes and encourage children to explore, solve problems and create. We also make deliberate and purposeful decisions about actions to take within the learning environment. And I guess that brings us to another role about challenge. And this might be related to some of the, the conversations we started to open up around risk. Do we build in sufficient challenge for children when we plan? Do we intentionally challenge children's thinking through conversations, open-ended questioning and feedback? And does the learning environment provide sufficiently challenging experience for all children of all abilities? Another role, I guess, we do need to look at is how we model for children and how we promote positive ways to relate to others and how we respond and the language we use can actually enable children to play successfully. So we can help children to recognise when play is not fair, for example, and we can offer and model ways to be more inclusive and fair. Another role that educators do, and we started to touch on this before, was around, actually getting in there and playing with children, engaging with them in what they're doing, having fun, relaxing, getting messy. Often educators might feel that they have to stand back and observe and don't actually engage in the play. We might even be too busy documenting the play to actually become involved in it. So there might be a message in there for us about having fun. We can also let children lead. And when you're watching play, you might consider where it may be leading. So we want to take that play in the direction that children are leading it and being aware of stepping in to support or scaffold if needed. And I guess some of the final points around the educator role is really, making it local and putting play in the context of children's spaces and their service community. So it's that unique learning environment that we're talking about here, and understanding family perspectives and also having culturally specific knowledge about our learning community. So the learning environment should reflect the lives and identities of children and families in children's own service community. So far, I guess we've only touched on intentional teaching as a focus, but we'll be looking at that later. At the moment, though, I'd like to move on now to consider documenting learning and how we might be doing that. So our challenge is to understand and unpack the play we see in our daily practice in order to provide meaning to it. And we're wanting to use a common language in describing where the learning is happening and what it looks like, and considering how we're going to document and share it. The early years learning framework provides us with a number of clear pathways for sharing the journey of children's development with our colleagues, and more importantly, with families. And the early years learning framework does have information about how we gather information, how we can use it, how we can draw on different perspectives, and that might be from different theorists even. So I'm sure that many of you probably have your favourite theories about how children are learning. I mean, one example is that early childhood can inform our approaches to children's learning and development from the developmental perspective, and that might be one of the theories that we incorporate in our work. And I guess that focuses on describing and understanding the processes of change in children's learning and development over time. So there may be other theories that you're also using in your work that can really contribute to what we're doing in that documentation space. How we gather and share knowledge is also important, and the tools that we have that can support our practice and the evidence that we can gather from children's play is important too, and how we share that with families and colleagues. So one of the first things we might consider is what information we're going to gather and ensure that we gather only what's actually important. It is important to know why we're gathering the knowledge of children's development. And we need to examine the learning strategies that children have used to understand things so we can make those curriculum decisions to feel confident in doing so. Sometimes educators are so busy gathering information, constantly taking photos or notes, for example, that they forget to be selective in what they choose. So national quality standards and the early years learning framework asks us as educators to be thoughtful about this process and to reflect on what's important. I mean, not all that we see may be relevant or valuable information in relation to children's learning and development. Gathering information can lead to reflection about your pedagogical practices. So some questions, when you're thinking about reflection, I guess, and documentation, some of the questions you might ask yourself is, how do the physical spaces, materials and daily routines impact on the play you're seeing? Another question might be, how will you continue to see things from the child's perspective? Or perhaps, what can you do to help children see things from a different point of view? How will you support children's relationships with each other, their families and the local community? And what can you do to actually collaborate with families? I think all of those questions are really important. And Michelle's saying, as educators, we watch, listen and plan for individual or group play and to interact with children on their level. Yeah, so great comment. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so following on from what we've been talking about, we're going to look now at challenges and what challenges there are in creating play-based environments. So we're going to start another poll, and this poll is around the challenges that we have to creating play-based environments. And I can see that already adults taking over during play is a really important area. Curriculum demands, yes. Okay, so Alicia, I'm wondering, in terms of, some of the challenges that we're looking here in the poll, sometimes I wonder about whether one challenge is actually relating to some of our own views and experiences and maybe attitudes about play. And even, some of the structural environments or cultural environments that educators are operating in. So, the whole idea about children spending inside time versus outside time, and, what we believe is good for children might be impacting here, and whether children have access to like nature-oriented environments, or, do our early learning services exist in very built structures. So if we're in high-rise kind of structures with not that much opportunity for, getting outside, how that might impact as a challenge. Or if there's a lot of concrete around, what do we do then?
Absolutely. And I can see here that 85% of us are saying adults taking over during children's play. And I can remember from my time working in education and care, not only was there a really big challenge around creating that indoor-outdoor flow of play, as you were mentioning, Kerry, but it was also about setting up spaces for supervision purposes and understanding the different needs of children's play. So how do we create spaces that are both developed for group play and social play, as well as solitary play, and having that downtime to spend time to recoup as a bit of an individual. And I can remember having many a debate with educators around how we created those spaces so that they were still able to supervise for children. Yes, thank you, everybody.
And Sharon's mentioned in the chat, educators not knowing what true play-based environments are. And I wonder how other people are feeling about that. Do we really know what true play-based environments are? I'm sure there's lots of different opinions around that.
Absolutely, and Manik's idea there that educators' own play experiences can impact it as well, absolutely. So one of the questions that I've been asking myself throughout this whole time, and I can see that Rosemary's also asked something really similar. Thank you, Rosemary. Where is the risk in play, and is there risk in play? And I want everybody to consider some of the following quotes that we've put together. The first one here is from Helle Nebelong, who's a Danish landscape architect. And she said, "I'm convinced that standardised play equipment is dangerous when the distance between all the rungs on the climbing ladder or the net are exactly the same. The child has no need to concentrate on where he puts his feet. The lesson cannot be carried over into all the knobbly and asymmetrical forms with which one is confronted throughout life." Think about that concept and the idea of nature play as I read this next quote from Edward Gill's article, "If You Go Down to the Woods." "There is growing evidence that children's mental health and emotional well-being is enhanced by contact with the outdoors, and that the restorative effect appears to be strongest in natural settings. Researchers are convinced of the connection between children's well-being and the environment, claiming that contact with nature may be as important to children as good nutrition and adequate sleep." And considering some of the things that we talked about earlier in today's webinar and the comments that you all provided around the ways that you played as children, I think it's really important for us to consider that connection between the nature play and the risk that we learn through when we engage in all of the knobbly and asymmetrical parts, as Helle said. Deb Curtis, in her article, "What's the Risk of No Risk?" looks at the difference between risks and hazards. And so she defines a risk that's something that is possible to negotiate and may be appropriate for particular situations and children, whereas a hazard is something that is inherently dangerous and needs to be remedied, such as a climbing structure with sharp edges or loose boards that could seriously injure children if they do play on it. In her article, she explores the challenges that educators face in balancing safety with learning. She comments that learning involves risks, relationships involve risks. Feeling competent and confident in the world requires meeting a challenge and working to overcome it. So I'm really curious about this idea, and I love the concept of risky play and how we incorporate it into our pedagogy. Tell us in the chat, what risky play have you been witnessing? So you can see there on our slide, we have a list of potential risk factors for both children and educators. And when I was looking at the slide and reflecting a little bit, the most prominent one that popped out for me with regards to risk for educators was that fear of litigation and the reluctance that we end up having to facilitate risky play or allow that experience to occur through fear that something may happen. An accident could occur and we could end up getting in trouble or having to put through a notification. Sometimes that can also include how we feel about supporting children one-on-one or in a context where they may need a little bit more intentional support through us, particularly when we have our educator to child ratios. And I can see here that a few of you are popping some concepts in the chat box around what risky play that you've been witnessing at the moment. So I can see here climbing trees and learning how to problem solve through risky play. Absolutely, Anita, that's a really big one and one of the most important parts about experiencing risky play. And I can see here that Kayleen has been witnessing some children playing with sticks on the ground, which is also a concept of risky play. When I look at the concept of what we've got up there for the risks for children and the list that we've got up there, I think the biggest one for me was the risk of losing a level of resilience. So for me, it's that idea, as we've said in the chat, when children are less resilient, they're less likely to persist through an issue or find a resolution, and therefore they become more reliant on the people around them for support. And I often wonder what my own mental health and well-being would be like if I didn't have the confidence to think or even try a solution to a particular problem that I was having. And I often try and remind myself that I'm not here raising children to remain children. I'm here to support them to become functioning members of our society. And I can see here a few more comments in the chat. Thank you. So the idea of being bubble wrap parenting, and you love the risk of losing children, needing to get lost and keep trying that experience. Thank you so much for your comments there. So I really want us to revisit Ken Finch's comment that Kerry read us earlier in today's session in relation to our role in making curriculum decisions. Risks are an integral part of progress. Thus, the goal shouldn't be to eliminate all risks from our children's lives, but to manage them and keep them in perspective. Oh, thank you, Manik. Yep, saying that it's true, we need to support children to become efficient and productive community members. Great. Thank you, everybody, for those contributions. It's great to hear your thoughts as well. Thank you. So I wonder what's stopping us? What is preventing us from engaging in that risky play? And what do we do to overcome our concerns about engaging in risky play? Now that you've spent some time telling us all about the risky play that you've been witnessing, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the ways that you overcome concerns around engaging and facilitating some of that risky play. Risk is not necessarily about being hurt. Technically, applying paint to a blank piece of paper is a risk for a child who's never done it before. It's also not about physical risk either. Taking a risk can be something as smaller, like a child making a friend for the very first time. We create adventurous children and inquiring minds from a really early age. We engage children and encourage them to explore the world around them. If we then remove all risks and challenge from the play environment so that it is risk-free, we are ultimately discouraging their learning. Deb Curtis said, when children are involved in a situation we think is too risky or dangerous, rather than just stopping them, we can offer alternatives that keep them safe, and they can become competent decision makers, able to assess risks, contribute to the well-being of others, and reap the rewards of their efforts. It is ultimately the role of educators to balance this risk with the learning. And so thinking about what you all do in order to help overcome the concerns around risk, I can see here that we've suggested managing our spacing in our groups. Thank you very much for that. I can also see here that Anita's telling us that we're developing risk management plans and educating staff upon what risky play is and what a hazard is, so back to those definitions again, and also assisting with helping parents to understand as well. Thank you, Anita. Those are really fantastic strategies to help you overcome those concerns. Thank you. So Kerry mentioned earlier that we were going to come back to the concept of intentional teaching, and that's what we're going to take a look at now. The EYLF defines intentional teaching as involving educators being deliberate, purposeful and thoughtful in their decisions and actions. And ultimately, when we engage in intentional teaching, we are recognising that learning occurs in a social context and acknowledges the importance of interactions and conversations for learning. Intentional teaching opportunities are planned, they're not ad hoc. These planned opportunities provide children with challenging play experiences and interactions that support their learning and development. Even when we are taking advantage of spontaneous intentional teaching and learning opportunities, as an educator, we're still creating a plan for scaffolding the learning based off our existing knowledge of the child or the group of children. We consider their knowledge, strengths, skills and ideas. Intentional teaching does use a variety of strategies to extend children's thinking and learning. So, for example, we could use open-ended questioning, modelling, demonstrating, explaining, speculating for the children, pondering reflective questions, and problem solving. David Elkind, who wrote The Power of Play, discusses studies that have been done to compare children who do attend play-based programs with those who attend programs which concentrate on rote learning and academic skills. The studies did show that children in the more formalised learning programs had higher levels of anxiety and were less creative and had more negative attitudes towards school. What is clear is that play is an inborn childhood disposition that is not only enjoyable, but also central to learning and development. We know that play is varied and flexible, and there is no right or wrong way to play. Educators support children's social and emotional development through play by helping children feel safe and be safe, providing a time and a place to play, following the child's lead, providing opportunities for children to play with others, offering guidance by modelling ways to join in and solve conflicts. As previously mentioned, educators develop an understanding of what children know and how they can further support their learning and development. They do this by observing children and documenting and monitoring their learning. Intentional teaching requires knowledge of children's development and understanding. It's purposeful, planned, and with particular goals and outcomes in mind. Some questions that we have for you to reflect on today in light of everything that we've talked about in the webinar are here posted on the slide. You might like to record some of these down and take them back to your colleagues in your setting and have some professional conversations around your thoughts on play and the risk in play in your particular setting. So I guess we can wonder, what is play the ultimate learning tool? Tell us what you think in the chat box. And also, we'd love to invite you to share your action steps or what you're going to take away from today's webinar to move forward with in your services. We do have some quotes here which sum up our thoughts on play as that ultimate learning tool. The one that we have here on the slide: give children time to play in their own way. That idea of not interrupting them if we can, and providing them with the space to problem solve, be creative and express their own personalities. Anne Pello does also suggest that we fall into moments with children. A powerful statement, a reminder that play is about child's wonder, child's dreams and imaginings. The EYLF does state, children's immersion in their play illustrates how play enables them to simply enjoy being. And I can see here that Michelle said that when we engage with children, we're giving them the confidence and skills to engage in the play as well. Absolutely. That's another concept of that intentional teaching, about how we, as adults and educators, offer them the strategies and the ways of moving in and out of play. Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. I can see here that you're going to take away from today's webinar the amazing benefits and importance of play overall. Great. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. We have another quote here that I'd like to share. Adults need to give deference to children's thought and thinking. Often we watch and look at play with the eyes of an adult, yet children see things anew for the first time, and we need to let that happen without our interference. Our planning for play enables children to discover things, ideas, thoughts, imaginings for the very first time, and to wonder, to dream. Thanks everybody for sharing that in the chat. That's fantastic. Thinking about an example of how we might support children to engage in their dreams and their wonderings and their imaginings, I can remember a little girl who we'll call Alice, who was desperate to start engaging with her peers. She was only about 16 months of age, and she was really, really eager, but was finding it a little bit tricky and was feeling a bit reserved about initiating her play. And her security attachment handle at that point in time was with her teddy bear. And so my way of supporting her was to also bring in a teddy bear and use that to show and teach her how she might be able to support her peers by offering the teddy bear for play. I've loved seeing all these comments in the chat, Kerry. Kerry, what about you?
Yes, they're great. Yeah, thanks everyone. We're coming almost to the end of the webinar today, so thank you everyone for contributing. But just before we go, there's a few things we might wrap up with. As many of you know, these webinars are great ways to not only learn, reflect and put learning into action, but they can also assist in demonstrating our individual commitment to continued professional development. So if you've heard, like if we're talking about supporting documentation and guiding whole service or school professional learning and continuous improvement, one way that we can do that is by contacting our team today, and we can assist you with any questions that you might have. For anyone already with a participating service or school, if you already are registered as a participating service, then that's good to know. If you aren't, then if your school isn't registered, it's as simple as completing a short online form, and then we can help you to get started. So if you'd like to know more about that registration process and what's involved, check out how to start the experience today. We can certainly help you with that. What you've learnt today and acted on after this webinar could also be all that you need actually to finish off one of our professional learning topics. So you might like to also join in one of our national check-in events and talk about what you've learned and done. So check out those national check-in event dates. Remember though that check-ins aren't necessarily check-ups. Often the consultants who are facilitating and hosting those can really spot some great learning and action that educators are putting into place, and you may not even realise that that's going on. So it can be easier for a pair of eyes to bring that to our attention as well. So don't forget to complete the exit survey today. That's going up, I notice. Please include the names followed by the email addresses of anyone watching with you. And we really need those names and email addresses, particularly so that we ensure that everyone gets certificates. So just make sure that you've got all those details included. And we'd like to thank everyone for attending today and see you online again soon.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.